Hello, my name is Harper Wilson, though most people call me Harper. I'm 37 years old, and if you asked me what I do for a living, I'd probably give you a wry smile and say I'm in the business of proving that blood doesn't always make family. The story I'm about to tell you isn't a fairy tale with a happy ending tied up in a neat bow. It's my life, a complicated web of love, betrayal, corporate warfare, and the devastating price of choosing authenticity over acceptance. I grew up in the sprawling Wilson estate in the hills of Marin County, California, where the morning fog rolled in from San Francisco Bay and money flowed as freely as the California wine we produced. The Wilson family wasn't just wealthy, we were royalty in the world of luxury hospitality. My father, Richard Wilson, was the founder and CEO of Wilson Luxury Resorts, a chain of five-star hotels and resorts that catered to celebrities, politicians, and anyone with deep enough pockets to afford a $2,000 a night suite. If you've ever been abandoned by family when you needed them most, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe if you're ready to hear how I turned my pain into the perfect revenge. If you've ever stayed at a Wilson resort, you know what I'm talking about. Crystal chandeliers imported from Venice, Egyptian cotton sheets with thread counts higher than most people's salaries, and staff trained to anticipate your every need before you even knew you had it. Everything was perfect, pristine, and prohibitively expensive. That was my father's world, a world where exclusivity wasn't just a business model, it was a way of life. I was the eldest daughter, groomed from birth to inherit this empire of opulence. From the time I could walk, I was taught that the Wilson name carried weight, that we weren't just running hotels, we were curating experiences for the elite. My father would sit in his mahogany-paneled office overlooking the Pacific, explaining how my great-grandfather had started with a single boarding house in Napa Valley during Prohibition. "Harper," he'd say, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no, "you are the future of Wilson Luxury Resorts. Excellence isn't just what we do, it's who we are. Don't ever let me down." I'd nod obediently, though even as a child, something felt hollow about it all. Why did luxury have to mean exclusion? Why couldn't beautiful experiences be accessible to more people? Our household was like a perfectly orchestrated performance. My mother, Victoria, glided through life in designer gowns and diamond jewelry, hosting charity galas for causes she'd never personally experienced. My younger sister, Sophia, 3 years my junior, was a carbon copy of our mother, beautiful, polished, and completely content to live within the gilded cage of our family's expectations. And then there was me. I was the one who asked uncomfortable questions at dinner parties, the one who felt suffocated by the constant talk of occupancy rates and profit margins. I was the one who dreamed of something more meaningful than thread counts and champagne service. But my life truly changed when I met Daniel Rodriguez. He wasn't just the light in my privileged darkness, he was the earthquake that would eventually bring down everything my family had built. I met Daniel during my junior year at UCLA, where I was studying business administration with a minor in sustainable tourism. It was a crisp October morning, and I was sitting in the campus coffee shop, drowning in a corporate finance textbook when he walked in. He had this quiet confidence about him, wearing a simple flannel shirt and jeans that had clearly seen better days. His dark hair was slightly messy, like he'd been running his hands through it while studying, and when he smiled at the barista, it lit up his entire face. He ordered a simple black coffee, no fancy modifications, no demands, and when the barista mentioned they were out of his usual pastry, he just shrugged and said, "No worries, happens to the best of us." That small interaction told me everything I needed to know about his character. I was staring, I realized, when he caught my eye and walked over. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Everywhere else is taken." "Of course," I managed, trying to appear more composed than I felt. "Daniel Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand. "Harper Wilson," I replied, and when our hands touched, I felt something shift inside me, like a door I didn't even know was closed had suddenly opened. We started talking, and I quickly learned that Daniel wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. He was passionate, genuine, and had this way of seeing the world that made everything seem more vibrant. He told me about his family, about his father, Miguel Rodriguez, who had started Rodriguez Community Hotels with a single property in East Los Angeles. My dad always says, Daniel laughed, that everyone deserves a clean, safe place to rest their head, regardless of their bank account balance. I smiled, but something twisted in my stomach. Rodriguez Community Hotels. That name was familiar, and not in a good way. It was the thorn in my father's side, the budget hotel chain that had been expanding rapidly across California, offering clean, comfortable accommodations at prices that working families could actually afford. The Rodriguez family and the Wilsons were like two sides of a very expensive coin. Wilson Luxury Resorts prided itself on being the ultimate in exclusivity, where guests paid thousands for experiences they could boast about to their equally wealthy friends. My father often referred to budget hotels like Rodriguez's as those motels with a disdain that made my skin crawl. But Rodriguez Community Hotels had a different philosophy entirely. Miguel Rodriguez, Daniel's father, had built his business on the principle that hospitality should be about making people feel welcome and valued, not about how much they could afford to spend. Their hotels featured clean, modern rooms, free breakfast, and rates that a teacher or nurse could actually afford for a family vacation. My father called it cheapening the industry, but I was beginning to think it might be the most honest thing I'd ever heard. The rivalry between our families wasn't just philosophical, it was personal and very public. Wilson Luxury Resorts and Rodriguez Community Hotels had been locked in legal battles over zoning rights in key California markets. They'd competed for the same prime real estate in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Once, at a hospitality industry conference, my father and Miguel Rodriguez had gotten into a heated argument about the true meaning of hospitality that made headlines in trade publications. My sister Sophia jokingly called it the War of the Welcome Mats. But to me, it felt like a Shakespearean tragedy where both sides were too proud to see the damage they were causing. Daniel and I fell in love despite the obstacles, or maybe because of them. Our dates weren't at five-star restaurants or exclusive clubs. We preferred small diners in Venice Beach, hiking trails in the Santa Monica Mountains, and late-night conversations in 24-hour coffee shops near campus. Daniel carried a worn notebook where he sketched out ideas for sustainable tourism and community development. Imagine, he'd say, his eyes lighting up with passion, hotels that actually benefit the communities they're built in. Places where locals can afford to eat in the restaurant, where the staff earns a living wage, where tourism dollars stay in the neighborhood instead of flowing to offshore accounts. I loved his vision, the way he saw hospitality as a force for good rather than just profit. But I knew our love was walking on thin ice. My father would never accept Daniel, not just because he was Miguel Rodriguez's son, but because he represented everything my father had spent his life working against. The storm hit on a cold February evening when I brought Daniel home to meet my family. I'd been dreading it for months, but I couldn't keep living a double life. The Wilson estate was lit up like a palace, with valet parking and staff in formal uniforms. Daniel looked around with barely concealed amazement and discomfort. "Harper," he whispered as we walked up the marble steps, "are you sure about this?" I squeezed his hand. "They need to meet the man I love." Dinner was served in our formal dining room, complete with crystal glasses and silver service. My mother sat rigidly in her pearl necklace, Sophia picked at her food while texting, and my father presided over the table like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "this is Daniel Rodriguez. He's studying sustainable business practices at UCLA." The silence was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop on the Persian rug. Then my father spoke, his voice colder than the San Francisco fog. "Rodriguez. Miguel Rodriguez's son. The one whose father is destroying the hospitality industry with his cheap motels." Daniel sat straighter, meeting my father's gaze without flinching. "Mr. Wilson," he said respectfully, "my father built Rodriguez Community Hotels to serve working families. We're not trying to destroy anything, we're trying to create something better." My father's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Better? You think putting families in budget rooms next to highway truck stops is better?" You're devaluing everything this industry stands for. And Harper, he turned to me, his eyes blazing, you're embarrassing this family. The evening devolved into a screaming match. My father stood up, pointed his finger at me, and declared, "If you choose this boy, you're choosing to walk away from everything we've built. You'll be cut off, financially, socially, completely." Sophia smirked behind her wine glass, clearly enjoying the drama. My mother just stared at her plate, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her napkin. I walked Daniel to his beat-up Honda Civic, apologizing for everything. But he just shook his head and pulled me into his arms. "Harper, I don't need your family's approval. I just need you." The weeks that followed were brutal. My father summoned me to his corner office in downtown San Francisco, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. The room felt like a courtroom, and I was clearly the defendant. "I've made my decision," he said without preamble. "Sophia will inherit the company. You're no longer part of the succession plan." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "Because of Daniel?" "Because you've betrayed everything this family represents," he replied coldly. "You've chosen the son of our biggest competitor, a boy who represents everything we stand against. You're on your own now, Harper." I left that office feeling like I'd been cut adrift in the middle of the ocean. I'd lost my inheritance, my father's approval, and possibly my entire family. But when I called Daniel and heard his warm voice, I knew I'd made the right choice. He was my anchor in the storm. Meanwhile, I met the Rodriguez family at their modest home in Boyle Heights. Their house was a small Spanish colonial with a vegetable garden in the backyard and the warm smell of homemade tortillas drifting from the kitchen. Miguel Rodriguez, Daniel's father, greeted me like I was already family. "Harper," he said, his weathered hands gentle as he shook mine, "you love my son, and that's all that matters to me. I don't care if you're Richard Wilson's daughter or anyone else. You're family now." Standing in that kitchen, surrounded by Daniel's aunts and cousins and siblings, I felt more accepted in 5 minutes than I had in 25 years of Wilson family dinners. But I knew this was just the beginning. The war between the Wilsons and the Rodriguezes wasn't just about business, it was about two completely different philosophies of life. And I was standing exactly on the battle line. My story was just beginning. Because this isn't just a story about hotels, money, or corporate rivalry. It's a story about love, choices, and the price you pay when you dare to live authentically in a world that demands conformity. I stood in the mirror of our small apartment in Silver Lake, trying to fix my hair with hands that still shook when I thought about what I'd lost. It had been 4 years since that devastating dinner, since my father had disowned me, since Sophia had become the heir to Wilson Luxury Resorts, and since I'd chosen Daniel over everything I'd been raised to value. 4 years. Yet every morning when I looked at my reflection, I could still see my father's disapproving stare, could still hear Sophia's satisfied smirk when she realized she'd gotten everything she'd always wanted by default. I didn't join Rodriguez Community Hotels despite Miguel Rodriguez offering me a position multiple times. "You have vision, Mija," he'd say during family dinners in Boyle Heights. "You could help us reach more families who need what we offer." But I declined. I wanted to prove myself independently, not be known as the Wilson heiress who ran to her boyfriend's family business. Maybe I was still trying to prove something to my father, even though he'd made it clear he was done with me. Instead, I chose a different path. I joined EcoStay, a small startup in Los Angeles focused on sustainable hospitality. My job was to help independent hotels and small chains implement eco-friendly practices that would reduce their environmental impact while cutting costs. It was challenging work, long days in cramped offices, late nights crunching carbon footprint data and researching renewable energy solutions. But I loved it. I loved working with people who cared about more than profit margins, who believed that hospitality could be a force for environmental good. My colleagues didn't care whose daughter I was, they only cared about what I could contribute. Daniel and I got married on a warm spring afternoon in a community garden in East LA. The ceremony was small and beautiful, just the Rodriguez family, a few close friends from UCLA, and an officiant who spoke about love as an act of courage. Miguel walked me down the aisle since my own father couldn't be bothered to show up. "You're my daughter now, Harper," Miguel whispered as he hugged me after the ceremony. "Take care of each other." None of the Wilsons came. I'd sent invitations even though I knew better. My mother sent a brief text, "Wishing you happiness, Harper. I'm sorry I can't be there." My father said nothing. Sophia posted a photo on Instagram from a spa weekend in Napa with the caption, "While some people are making questionable life choices, I'm living my best life. #blessed #family first." I saw the post and felt that familiar stab of pain, but Daniel squeezed my hand and reminded me that we'd chosen love over pettiness. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Los Angeles became our home. We found a small apartment in Silver Lake with big windows and a tiny balcony where Daniel grew herbs for cooking. It wasn't the Wilson estate, but it was ours. I still remember our first night there, sitting on the floor surrounded by moving boxes, sharing takeout Chinese food and laughing about our complete lack of furniture. "Harper," Daniel said, gesturing around our empty living room, "we have a home. A real home that we're building together." I laughed and leaned into his arms, feeling happier than I ever had in the mansion in Marin County. 3 years later, Emma was born. She had Daniel's dark eyes and my stubborn chin, and she changed everything about how I understood love. When Emma was 2, we had Gabriel, a quiet, thoughtful boy who seemed to absorb everything around him with intense curiosity. Watching our children play in our small living room, I felt like I'd discovered the real meaning of wealth. It wasn't the crystal chandeliers or Egyptian cotton sheets of my childhood. It was Emma's belly laugh when Daniel tickled her, Gabriel's tiny hand gripping my finger as he fell asleep, the warm chaos of a family that chose each other every single day. Daniel worked for a nonprofit organization that developed affordable housing with his architecture degree. In the evenings, he'd sit at our kitchen table sketching plans for community centers and mixed-use developments. "If we could integrate hospitality spaces into affordable housing," he'd say, his eyes bright with possibility, "we could create communities where people actually want to live and visit." I loved how he thought about everything, how every building could serve multiple purposes, how tourism could benefit rather than displace local communities. But not everything was perfect. Despite my efforts to cut ties with the Wilsons, their shadow followed me everywhere. My mother called occasionally, her voice heavy with guilt and longing, but never quite brave enough to defy my father. "Harper, how are you doing?" she'd ask in these stilted conversations. "How are the children?" I'd answer briefly, always hoping she might surprise me by actually visiting or standing up to my father. But she never did. Sophia was different. She seemed to enjoy reminding me of what I'd given up. She'd send me articles about Wilson Luxury Resorts expansion with messages like, "Look what you're missing. We just opened a new resort in Hawaii. Guess you'll never see it." I rarely responded, but her words still stung, not because I regretted my choices, but because I'd hoped my family might eventually change. I sent photos and updates about Emma and Gabriel to my mother, sharing stories about our life in Silver Lake. Sometimes she'd respond with a brief, "Thank you for sharing," or a birthday card with a check that I'd always return. We didn't need their money, we were building something better. Life at EcoStay was challenging but rewarding. Our startup was small, competing against big consulting firms with established relationships and deep pockets. Some weeks I worked 80 hours, falling asleep at my desk and coming home with dark circles under my eyes. But Daniel was always there with coffee and encouragement. "You're changing how people think about hospitality," he'd tell me. "Every hotel that implements your sustainability programs is a step toward a better future. Don't give up." And I didn't. We developed a comprehensive green certification program that helped hotels reduce their environmental impact by up to 40% while cutting operating costs. Small hotel owners began to trust us, and EcoStay's reputation grew steadily. I wasn't making millions like my father, but I was proud that my work had meaning. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel and I took Emma and Gabriel for a picnic at Griffith Park. Emma, now 5, ran around the grass chasing butterflies while Gabriel, 3, toddled after her with determination. Daniel and I sat on our blanket, watching them with the particular contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. You know, Daniel said, pulling me closer, sometimes I think we've created our own little paradise. I kissed his cheek, breathing in the scent of the eucalyptus trees around us. My paradise is anywhere you and the kids are. It was one of those perfect moments, the kind you want to bottle and keep forever. But I didn't know that in just a few hours, everything would shatter like glass hitting concrete. We were driving home as the sun set over the Santa Monica Mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Emma had fallen asleep in her car seat, still clutching the butterfly net we'd bought her. Gabriel was drowsy, his head lolling against his sister's shoulder. Daniel sat beside me, humming softly along with the radio. The Pacific Coast Highway was unusually busy for a weekend evening, but I wasn't worried. I was a careful driver and the road was familiar. I was thinking about the week ahead, about a presentation I needed to give to a potential client, when I saw the headlights. A massive delivery truck had crossed the center divider, heading straight for us. I heard Daniel shout, "Harper, watch out!" And then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. My right arm was in a cast, my head was bandaged, and there was a pain in my chest that had nothing to do with physical injuries. A nurse was checking my chart, her face carefully neutral. "You're awake," she said gently. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. You have a broken arm and a concussion, but you're going to be okay." Okay? The word felt foreign in my mouth. Where's my family? Where are Daniel and the kids? The nurse's expression changed and she looked away. "I'll get the doctor," she said, hurrying out of the room. I knew. Somehow I already knew. But knowing and accepting are two different things, and I wasn't ready to accept anything. The doctor who entered was a kind-faced woman in her 50s. She sat beside my bed and took my uninjured hand in hers. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said softly, "I'm so sorry. The accident was severe. The truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. Your husband and children, they didn't survive the impact." The world stopped. Everything I'd built, everyone I'd chosen to love, gone in an instant. Daniel with his warm smile and big dreams. Emma with her infectious laugh and butterfly obsession. Gabriel with his serious little face and gentle way of exploring the world. Gone. I don't remember much about the next few days. The Rodriguez family appeared at my bedside like guardian angels, holding my hands and whispering prayers in Spanish and English. Miguel's weathered face was streaked with tears as he gripped my fingers. "Mija," he said, his voice broken, "you are still our daughter. We lost Daniel and the babies, but we won't lose you too." His wife, Carmen, sat beside my bed and sang the lullabies she used to sing to Daniel when he was small. Their presence was the only thing keeping me tethered to a world that no longer made sense. I called my mother from the hospital, leaving a voicemail that I could barely get through. "Mom, there's been an accident. Daniel and the children are gone. I need." But I couldn't finish. What did I need? My husband back? My children back? My family to prove that blood ties meant something when everything else was stripped away? My mother called back within an hour, sobbing. "Harper, I wanted to come, but your father, he said we shouldn't interfere with the life you chose. But I want to be there. I'm trying to." "Mom," I interrupted, my voice flat with shock and grief, "my husband and children are dead. Your grandchildren are dead. Do you understand?" She cried harder, but she didn't come. None of them came. Later, I learned the devastating truth. While I was in the hospital, while the Rodriguez family was planning funerals for my husband and children, my father was hosting a launch party for Wilson Luxury Resort's newest property in Monterey. The guest list included celebrities, politicians, and hospitality industry leaders. The champagne flowed, the photographers captured every moment, and my father gave speeches about the Wilson family legacy. The funeral was held at a small church in Boyle Heights where Daniel had grown up. I sat in the front pew staring at 3 caskets, 2 so small they broke what was left of my heart. Emma looked peaceful, like she was just sleeping, still wearing the butterfly bracelet Daniel had given her for her birthday. Gabriel's tiny hands were folded over his chest, and he looked like he was dreaming of something wonderful. Daniel. Daniel looked like he was waiting for me to wake up so he could tell me about his latest idea for making the world better. I'd sent funeral notices to the Wilsons, despite Miguel's advice against it. "They don't deserve your grief, Mija," he'd said. But I sent them anyway, foolishly hoping that death might soften their hearts, that they'd realize what truly mattered. But no one came. Not a flower, not a card, not even a text message. I stood at those graves, holding a speech I couldn't bring myself to read, and Miguel stood beside me with his arm around my shoulders. "You haven't lost everything, Harper," he said, his voice thick with his own grief. "You've still got family. We're still here." I nodded, but inside I felt completely hollow. Daniel had been my partner, my best friend, my future. Emma and Gabriel had been my purpose, my joy, my reason for getting up every morning. Now I was left with nothing but memories and a family that had chosen pride over love even in the face of ultimate tragedy. The months after the funeral passed in a gray haze. I returned to the Silver Lake apartment where everything reminded me of them. Emma's art supplies still scattered across the kitchen table, Gabriel's stuffed animals lined up on his bed, Daniel's architectural sketches pinned to the wall above his desk. I couldn't touch them, but I couldn't throw them away either. Miguel and Carmen visited constantly, bringing food and stories and the steady presence of people who understood loss. They were grieving too. They'd lost their son and grandchildren, but they refused to let me disappear into my pain. "Daniel wouldn't want this for you," Carmen would say gently, sitting beside me on the couch where Daniel used to read to the children. "He'd want you to live, to keep fighting for the things you both believed in." One evening there was a knock at my door. I opened it expecting Miguel or Carmen, but it was my mother. She stood there in a simple coat, her usually perfect hair disheveled, her eyes red and swollen. "Harper," she said, her voice trembling, "I couldn't stay away anymore." I let her in, and she held me while I cried for the first time since the accident. We sat in my dark living room, and she told me things I'd never known, how my father controlled every aspect of her life, how she'd wanted to leave him years ago but felt trapped by financial dependence and social expectations. "I should have come to the funeral," she whispered. "I should have been there for you. I'm so sorry." Her presence couldn't bring back Daniel and the children, but it reminded me that not everyone in my biological family had completely lost their humanity. 6 months after the accident, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living as a ghost in my own life. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at the hollow-eyed woman staring back at me, and spoke aloud for the first time in weeks. "You have to do something, Harper. For Daniel, for Emma, for Gabriel. You have to live." I wrote a final letter to my father and sister. It was short and to the point. "I am no longer part of the Wilson family. Don't contact me again." I sold the small amount of Wilson luxury resort stock my grandfather had left me. Not much, but enough to give me some financial breathing room. Then I called Miguel. "Papa," I said, using the name I'd started calling him after Daniel and I married, "I want to join Rodriguez Community Hotels. I want to carry on what Daniel believed in." There was silence on the other end, then Miguel's voice, thick with emotion, "Welcome home, Mija. Daniel would be so proud." I moved back to Boyle Heights, into a small guest house behind Miguel and Carmen's home. The neighborhood was vibrant and alive, children playing in the streets, families gathering for backyard barbecues, the sound of multiple languages mixing together in the warm California air. It felt like the opposite of the sterile perfection of Marin County, and for the first time in months I could breathe. Joining Rodriguez Community Hotels sent shockwaves through the hospitality industry. Trade publications ran headlines like "Wilson Heiress joins family's biggest competitor," and "From luxury to budget, Harper Wilson's dramatic career change." Some called me a traitor, others a visionary breaking free from tradition. I didn't care about the headlines. I was doing this for Daniel, for Emma and Gabriel, and for the dreams we'd shared about making hospitality more accessible and meaningful. Miguel brought me into the company as Director of Sustainable Development, a new position created specifically for me. Rodriguez Community Hotel's headquarters was in a converted warehouse in downtown LA, nothing like the gleaming towers where Wilson Luxury Resorts operated. But there was something warm and authentic about the place, employees who called Miguel T.O., and worked not just for paychecks, but because they believed in the mission. On my first day, I sat in a conference room with Miguel and the other department heads. They looked at me with curiosity, some with skepticism. "You're Richard Wilson's daughter," the operations manager said carefully. "Why are you here?" I met his gaze steadily. "I'm here because I believe in what Rodriguez Community Hotels represents, and because I want to honor my husband's memory by making travel accessible to working families." The room fell quiet. Then Miguel smiled and put his hand on my shoulder. "That's exactly the answer I hoped for. Let's get to work." I threw myself into the job like someone running toward salvation. Every morning, I'd wake before dawn, reviewing Daniel's old notebooks and sketches for inspiration. I proposed a comprehensive sustainability initiative that would make Rodriguez Community Hotels the first budget chain to achieve carbon neutrality, while actually reducing costs for guests. The concept was ambitious but simple: integrate renewable energy, local sourcing, and community partnerships to create hotels that benefited both travelers and the neighborhoods they were built in. If successful, it would position Rodriguez Community Hotels to compete directly with Wilson Luxury Resorts in major markets, not by offering luxury, but by offering something better: authentic value and environmental responsibility. Miguel supported me completely. "Daniel would be proud of you, Mija," he said during one of our late-night planning sessions. "You're building the future he dreamed about." Hearing Daniel's name always made my chest tighten, but I'd learned to channel that pain into determination. I wasn't just working for the company, I was working to prove that there was a better way to think about hospitality. The Welcome Home campaign launched 6 months later. It was my idea, inspired by Daniel's belief that hotels should make every guest feel valued regardless of their budget. We weren't just offering rooms, we were offering belonging. Our advertisements featured real families, teachers, nurses, people who worked hard and deserved beautiful vacations they could actually afford. The campaign was a direct challenge to Wilson Luxury Resorts' philosophy of exclusivity. My father's hotels told guests they were special because they could afford to pay more. Our hotels told guests they were special because they were human beings who deserved comfort and respect. The response was overwhelming. Occupancy rates at Rodriguez Community Hotels skyrocketed across California, Arizona, and Nevada. Families who'd never considered hotel vacations before were booking weekend getaways. Travel bloggers started writing about our revolutionary approach to budget hospitality. One evening, as I worked late in my office, my phone rang. It was Sophia. "Well, well," her voice came through sharp and mocking. "Look who's making waves in the family business. Congratulations, Harper. You've officially become a trader." "Sophia," I said, keeping my voice level, "if you're just calling to insult me, I'm hanging up." "Oh no," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I wanted to let you know that Daddy's not taking this lying down. You think you can compete with Wilson Luxury Resorts? You're delusional. We'll crush you." I hung up without responding, but her words echoed in my mind. I knew my father. He wasn't just a businessman, he was someone who took every challenge personally. And I, his eldest daughter, was now his greatest threat. I sat in my small office at Rodriguez Community Hotel's headquarters in downtown LA, fluorescent lights humming overhead as I reviewed the latest revenue reports. The numbers told an incredible story. Rodriguez Community Hotels was growing faster than anyone had predicted. Our Welcome Home campaign had fundamentally changed how people thought about budget travel. Families were choosing us over established chains, not just because of price, but because of values. We offered the same clean, comfortable rooms as our competitors, but we also offered solar-powered properties, locally sourced breakfast options, and partnerships with community organizations that made guests feel like they were contributing to something positive rather than just consuming. But I didn't let success make me complacent. Every night before bed, I opened one of Daniel's old sketchbooks, tracing his handwriting with my finger. Hospitality should heal communities, not extract from them, he'd written in the margins of a sustainable development textbook. Those words kept me focused on why I was doing this work. Miguel called me into his office one morning as the California sun streamed through the windows overlooking the Arts District. He sat behind his desk, his gray hair silver in the light, but his eyes as determined as ever. "Harper," he said, sliding a folder across the desk, "you've accomplished something I never thought possible. Rodriguez Community Hotels is being talked about in boardrooms across the country. But you know what that means, don't you?" I looked at him, waiting. He smiled, but there was concern in his expression. "It means Richard Wilson won't sit quietly while we take market share from his luxury properties. A man like your father doesn't accept defeat gracefully." I nodded. I knew my father too well. He was the type of man who would burn down the entire industry rather than admit he'd been wrong about anything. "I'm ready," I said. "If he wants a fight, I'll give him one." Miguel studied my face carefully. "You remind me of Daniel," he said finally. "He had that same fire when he believed in something. But Harper, this isn't just business anymore. This is personal." Wilson Luxury Resorts began their counterattack sooner than I expected. First came the lawsuit, a claim that our Welcome Home campaign infringed on intellectual property from an old Wilson marketing initiative from the 1990s. It was baseless. Our campaign had nothing in common with their previous work except the concept of making guests feel valued. But my father wasn't trying to win. He was trying to tie us up in expensive legal battles. Then came the dirty tricks. Suddenly, Rodriguez Community Hotels faced surprise health inspections at properties that had passed with flying colors just months before. Environmental permits for our solar installations were delayed by bureaucratic red tape that hadn't existed before. Suppliers who'd been eager to work with us started backing out of contracts, citing pressure from industry leaders. I called an emergency meeting with our legal team and department heads. "They're trying to strangle us with regulations and fear," I said, my voice steady despite my anger. "But we won't back down. Every dirty trick they pull just proves that what we're doing is working." Our head of operations, a former Wilson employee named Marcus Chen, who joined us 6 months earlier, spoke up. "Harper, your father isn't just trying to hurt the company. He's trying to hurt you personally. I've heard rumors that he's telling people you had a mental breakdown after your family died, that you can't be trusted with business decisions." The room fell silent. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not embarrassment but fury. Using my grief as a weapon was lower than even I'd expected from my father. "Let him spread his rumors," I said finally. "Our results speak louder than his gossip." But the attacks intensified. Wilson Luxury Resorts launched their own sustainability initiative, a transparent attempt to steal our thunder. They hired a high-profile environmental consultant and announced plans to retrofit their properties with solar panels and organic gardens. Their press releases made it sound like they'd invented the concept of eco-friendly hospitality. The media bought it. Articles started appearing with headlines like "Wilson Luxury Resorts Goes Green" and "Can Budget Hotels Compete with Luxury Sustainability?" Some journalists even suggested that Rodriguez Community Hotels had been copying Wilson's environmental initiatives all along. I read those articles with a mixture of rage and determination. My father was rewriting history, trying to claim credit for ideas that Daniel had been developing years before Wilson Luxury Resorts even acknowledged that climate change existed. But we had something they couldn't fake: authenticity. Our sustainability wasn't a marketing campaign, it was woven into our business model from the beginning. When guests stayed at our hotels, they could see the difference. Solar panels weren't just for show, they actually powered the buildings. Our local partnerships weren't photo opportunities, they were genuine relationships with community organizations. The turning point came at the National Hospitality Conference in Las Vegas. I was invited to speak as Rodriguez Community Hotels representative, and I knew my father would be there, watching from the audience like a hawk circling prey. I stood on that stage, looking out at hundreds of industry professionals, hotel owners, and journalists. Somewhere in that sea of faces was the man who'd raised me, who'd taught me about excellence, and who'd cut me out of his life when I chose love over loyalty. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "hospitality isn't about how much money your guests can spend. It's about how valued they feel when they walk through your doors. Rodriguez Community Hotels doesn't just offer rooms. We offer dignity, sustainability, and the radical idea that everyone deserves to travel with comfort and respect." I talked about Daniel's vision, about communities that benefited from tourism instead of being displaced by it. I shared data about our carbon reduction, our local hiring practices, our partnerships with schools and nonprofits. But most importantly, I talked about the families who'd written to us, thanking us for making their first real vacation possible. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. A reporter from Forbes stood up during the Q&A session. "Ms. Wilson, excuse me, Ms. Rodriguez, do you see your company's success as a direct challenge to luxury hospitality, specifically your father's empire?" I smiled, not triumphantly, but with the confidence of someone who'd found her true path. "I'm not challenging anyone," I said. "I'm simply honoring my late husband's belief that hospitality should serve everyone, not just the wealthy. If that makes us competitors with anyone, that's their choice to make." The applause was even louder this time. As I left the stage, I caught a glimpse of my father in the back row. His face was stone, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He didn't clap. After the conference, industry publications exploded with coverage. "Harper Rodriguez, the revolutionary changing budget hospitality," read one headline. Another called me the Wilson who chose values over wealth. Some compared our David and Goliath story to classic business turnarounds. But the real victory came in our quarterly reports. Rodriguez Community Hotels had achieved something unprecedented. We'd expanded into luxury markets without abandoning our core values. Our new community luxury properties offered beautiful, sustainable accommodations at prices working families could afford for special occasions. We were proving that you didn't have to choose between quality and accessibility. Wilson Luxury Resorts' response was swift and vicious. They launched a massive advertising campaign emphasizing their heritage of excellence and uncompromising standards. The subtext was clear: don't trust the upstarts who prioritize price over prestige. But their stock prices told a different story. Shareholders were questioning whether Wilson's elitist model was sustainable in an economy where more Americans were struggling financially. Occupancy rates at their properties began declining, especially in markets where we'd opened competing hotels. Sophia started appearing on business news shows, desperately trying to maintain the facade of confidence. In one particularly painful interview on CNBC, she sat in a perfectly tailored suit, her smile too bright. "Wilson Luxury Resorts isn't worried about budget competitors," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying anxiety. "We serve discerning travelers who understand that true luxury can't be replicated at discount prices. Quality will always win over quantity." I turned off the television, feeling a strange mix of pity and vindication. Sophia had gotten everything she'd always wanted: the company, the inheritance, my father's approval. But she was drowning in responsibility she'd never been prepared for. The final blow came when Wilson Luxury Resorts lost their biggest contract, the exclusive hospitality partnership with a major international airline. The airline cited changing customer preferences and alignment with corporate social responsibility goals in their decision to switch to Rodriguez Community Hotels. It was a devastating loss for Wilson, millions in annual revenue and a public relations nightmare. The business press began openly speculating about the company's long-term viability. One evening, I received an email from an address I hadn't seen in years: richard.wilson@wilsonluxury.com. The subject line was empty, but the message was brief: "Meet me at the Fairmont San Francisco, Suite 2012, Friday at 7 p.m. We need to talk. Tablo." I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it, to let him drown in the consequences of his choices. But another part, the part that still remembered being Daddy's little girl, couldn't turn away. I replied, "I'll be there." San Francisco greeted me with its familiar fog, rolling in from the bay as the city lights began to twinkle. The Fairmont was one of the grand old hotels, the kind of place where my father had conducted business for decades. As I walked through the opulent lobby, I felt like a different person than the young woman who'd once accompanied him to similar meetings. Suite 2012 was on an upper floor with windows overlooking Nob Hill. When I knocked, my father opened the door himself. No assistants, no security, just a man who looked older and more fragile than I remembered. "Harper," he said simply, stepping aside to let me in. The suite was elegant but not ostentatious. Cream-colored furniture, fresh flowers, a small bar set up with expensive whiskey. My father gestured to the sitting area, and we sat across from each other like negotiators preparing for battle. "You look well," he said, and I was surprised to hear something that might have been genuine concern in his voice. "I am well," I replied carefully. "I'm doing work that matters." He poured himself a whiskey, offered me one, which I declined. For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of 4 years of estrangement filling the space between us. "Rodriguez Community Hotels is destroying everything I built," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "You're destroying yourself," I replied. "I'm just offering people what they actually want, hospitality that respects both their budgets and their dignity." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "Wilson Luxury Resorts is failing, Harper. Stock prices are down 60%. We've had to close properties in 3 states. The board is questioning Sophia's leadership." I felt a flicker of something, not satisfaction but sadness. "I never wanted to destroy you, Dad. I just wanted to build something better." He turned back to me, and for the first time in my life, I saw vulnerability in his eyes. "I need you to come back, Harper. Help me save the company. Sophia, she's not strong enough for this. You always were the real heir." I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. "Come back? After you disowned me? After you didn't even acknowledge that your grandchildren died?" His face hardened again. "I was protecting the family business. You chose to marry our competitor's son. You chose to work for our enemies." "I chose love," I said, standing up. "I chose authenticity over appearances. And when I lost everything that mattered to me, you chose a party over being there for your daughter." "I had responsibilities." "You had a choice," I interrupted. "And you chose wrong. Every single time." I walked toward the door, then turned back. "The company is failing because it's built on the wrong foundation. You taught people that worth is measured by what they can afford to spend. Daniel and I taught people that worth is inherent in being human. That's why we're winning." I left him standing there in that expensive suite, surrounded by all the luxury that had never been enough to fill the emptiness where his heart should have been. In the months that followed, Wilson Luxury Resorts collapsed faster than anyone predicted. The company filed for bankruptcy protection, unable to service its debt as revenue continued plummeting. Sophia appeared on television one last time, announcing that the Wilson family was exploring strategic options for the brand, corporate speak for admitting defeat. Rodriguez Community Hotels, meanwhile, became the dominant force in accessible hospitality. We expanded internationally, opening properties in Mexico, Canada, and Central America. The Welcome Home campaign became a case study in business schools, an example of how authentic values could triumph over entrenched power. But success couldn't fill the void in my heart. Every achievement felt hollow without Daniel to share it with, without Emma and Gabriel to make it meaningful. I threw myself into work and community service, establishing the Daniel Rodriguez Foundation to provide hospitality training for underserved youth, but the pain never fully disappeared. Miguel retired on his 70th birthday, passing the CEO role to me in a small ceremony at our headquarters. "Daniel would be so proud," he said, his eyes bright with tears. "You've made his dreams bigger than he ever imagined." I accepted the position with gratitude and determination, but also with the knowledge that success is meaningless without people to love and who love you back. 2 years later, I stood in the cemetery in Boyle Heights where Daniel, Emma, and Gabriel rested under a sprawling oak tree. The headstones were simple granite, engraved with their names and the words Daniel had always said, "Love is the only luxury that matters." I knelt and placed fresh sunflowers on each grave, Daniel's favorite because they always turned toward the light. "I did it," I whispered. "We changed everything, just like you wanted. I kept our promise." A warm breeze rustled the oak leaves, and for a moment, I could almost hear Emma's laughter, Gabriel's quiet observations, Daniel's voice planning a better world. They were gone, but their love had become the foundation for everything I'd built. As I walked back to my car, I pulled out my phone and saw a text from Carmen. "Dinner at 6? The whole family will be there. Miguel's making his famous mole." I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd had in weeks. The Rodriguez family had become my anchor, my chosen family in a world where blood relations had proved meaningless. I had work that mattered, people who loved me, and the knowledge that I'd honored the memory of those I'd lost by living authentically. My story doesn't end with revenge or total victory. It ends with understanding that family is something you build, not something you're born into. That success means creating something larger than yourself. And that love, even love that's been lost, can become the foundation for a life of meaning and purpose. I'm Harper Rodriguez now, not Harper Wilson. I'm a woman who lost everything and found herself again. Who turned grief into purpose and pain into power. Who learned that the greatest luxury isn't what you can afford, it's who you choose to become when everything else falls away. And every morning when I wake up in my small house in Boyle Heights, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and families gathering, I know I made the right choice. I chose love over loyalty, authenticity over acceptance, and meaning over money. That choice saved my life.